All right, guys, good morning. We're going to continue along with the herbal actions for the GI tract. And then after that, we're going to cover some of the herbs commonly used in the gastrointestinal tract. And we will go from there, okay? So this is where we left off, I believe, with osmotic laxatives. So an osmotic laxative is, so you probably know that laxatives in general are used to promote bowel movements, okay? I think that's pretty common knowledge for people. But the way that a laxative can work is by different mechanisms. So there's three main types of laxatives we're going to talk about. There's an osmotic laxative, a bulk laxative, and a stimulating laxative. There's also stool softener as well. I don't know if I mentioned that or not. So I guess there's four types, and there's probably, I don't think there's any other ones. So we'll start off with an osmotic laxative. Most of the time, I do use these a lot in practice, but this isn't directly related to herbal medicine for the most part. But there is a little bit of overlap in some ways, but not so much with the herbs that we learn in class, but more with your diet, okay? Also with supplementation. Oops, let me turn my phone off. So when it comes to osmotic laxatives, the way that it works is they promote a bowel movement through osmosis. And so what I mean by that is osmosis is the process where you have two solutions separated by a membrane, some barrier, semi-permeable barrier. And the idea is if you have a higher salt concentration on one side of the barrier, it creates a hypertonic gradient that pulls water into that through osmosis. Okay, so this goes back to like grade 7 chemistry or grade 11 chemistry or whatever grade it was. So when it comes to osmosis, some examples of this is when somebody has, let's say, lactose intolerance, where they drink a glass of milk and suddenly they get bloated and gassy and they get diarrhea. What's happening is their body's incapable of absorbing the lactose, the sugar in milk, and it remains in the lumen of the bowel, pulling water into the bowel. And also, by doing that, you're increasing the volume of the stool by increasing the amount of water, and that stimulates stretch receptors in the lumen of the bowel. That helps to hydrate the stool and also increases peristalsis. So when someone has milk, that's one thing that happens. If you have, and that's because of the sugar in it. Sugar can have that osmotic effect. If you, sometimes when kids eat too much sugar, they can end up getting diarrhea. And the reason for that is it overwhelms the transporters in their bowels in order to absorb the sugar, and they can end up getting some loose stools with it. Now, the bloating and gas that can accompany these two things is usually because the gut bacteria will ferment the lactose or sugars, producing gas. And so that's where the gas component comes into it. Now, in general, there are other things that can have an osmotic effect as well. So I'm assuming if you drank enough salt water, obviously that's not going to be good for you. But if you can't absorb all that salt, it'll have an osmotic effect. So getting a couple huge gulps of salt water when you're surfing or swimming in the ocean, that could cause a little bit of loose stools or diarrhea. Another thing is, so those are sort of unintentional osmotic laxatives. Now, in clinical practice, I use magnesium citrate a lot as a laxative. And the reason why I like magnesium citrate is it's easy to control the dose, and you can get it in powder form. So you can basically take half a teaspoon or a quarter teaspoon or increase it up to 1 teaspoon or whatever you might need to do to sort of customize it for the patient. So if the patient's feeling the bowels are a little sluggish, they can take a little bit. If they need more, they can take more. And any form of magnesium will have that effect. There's magnesium oxide, magnesium citrate, magnesium bisglycinate. I prefer, although you can use any of them, I prefer magnesium citrate mainly because it's pretty cost effective and that actually tastes good in a powder form. So If you take it in pill form, none of that will matter, but if you're doing it in powder form, often it'll come with some flavoring, so it might have like a citrusy or a raspberry like taste associated with it, which is nice, and so you can easily control that. The idea is that magnesium, basically, when you take a small amount, you'll absorb it, but when you take more than a certain amount, that could be a few hundred milligrams, some of it will remain in the bowels and pull the water and have that osmotic laxative effect. Now, in addition to magnesium as a supplement, there are things in your diet that can have an osmotic laxative effect as well. So most alcohol sugars are not well absorbed, and so they can remain in the lumen of the bowel to have that osmotic laxative effect as well. So most sugars in general will be absorbed unless you exceed the body's ability to absorb them. But to the best of my knowledge, most of the alcohol sugars like sorbitol, probably xylitol as well, in small amounts, you probably won't detect any changes. They may get fermented by your gut bacteria, but in higher amounts, they'll have that osmotic effect. And so prune juice is something that's, I'm sure most people have heard about prune juice for constipation. If you look at prune juice, it's lacking in significant amount of fiber. You know, it's relatively liquid. It might be a little bit viscous, but not really. It's pretty liquidy. And so the benefits of prune juice is not associated with the actual fiber content, but rather with the high concentration of sorbitol. And sorbitol will then have that osmotic laxative effect. So somebody could drink prune juice if they wanted to, or they could do magnesium citrate. Both of those will have that osmotic laxative effect. Now, the benefits of prune juice is, in addition to the sorbitol, you're getting beautiful anthocyanidins. And there's some research studies in mice that suggest that it may benefit people with osteoporosis, or not people, mice with osteoporosis. And it also has some antioxidant effects and other positive things that could be associated with it. There is sugar in it, which not everybody wants the sugar. So there's a balance, like any time you use fruit, you don't want to overdo it. So prune juice is nature's magnesium citrate in some ways. I mean, magnesium citrate is normal, but prune juice, you can get it that way. Also, if you just eat prunes, you'll get some osmotic effect. Another example would be kiwi. So kiwi has been shown to have a positive effect on bowel movements, partly because it's quite mucilaginous. Like if you look at the kiwi seeds, there is a lot of mucilage there, just like chia seeds are. And then it also has high amounts of sorbitol. So there you're getting some fiber, and we're going to talk about fiber in a second, along with the sorbitol to have that effect. Now, a lot of fruits do have alcohol sugars. Berries in general do have some. So the health benefits of eating fruits in particular, some of them will help promote bowel movements through the fiber content that we'll get to in a second, and also through this osmotic effect. Now, another thing that can have an osmotic effect is vitamin C. When you take 50 milligrams of vitamin C, you're probably going to absorb most of that. But when you start getting over 200 milligrams of vitamin C a day, or whatever the number is, I don't know precisely what it is, but let's say 2 or 3 or 400 levels of vitamin C in a single dose, not in divided dose, but in a single dose, your body can't absorb all that. And so it's going to remain in the bowel. So one of the side effects for people taking high dose vitamin C, if you try to take 10,000 milligrams of vitamin C orally, what you would find is that you would probably get diarrhea, especially if you took it in a single dose. And this varies from person to person. Some people can have more of it without an issue, and other people are very, very sensitive to it. So from a vitamin C supplement standpoint, if you give 1,000 milligrams, in reality, the amount in your blood doesn't change significantly from 500 to 1,000 milligrams. It certainly doesn't double. Maybe it goes up by another 10% or 20%, but it doesn't double. But what does double is the amount that's in the lumen, or maybe not even double. Maybe what it goes up several fold is the amount of vitamin C in the bowels. And so taking too much vitamin C in a single pill could be enough to trigger diarrhea. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is important to know is that if someone's taking a magnesium supplement, someone's taking a vitamin C supplement, and they're eating lots of vegetable or fruits, and they're getting some loose stools and diarrhea, you want to make sure that you rule out possible causes related to their diet and supplementation. So Vitamin C and magnesium in any form tend to be the two big ones. And then, as I mentioned, sugar in general. So one of the things that's important about taking osmotic laxatives, you want to make sure you take enough water, because if you're not drinking enough water and you end up taking one of these osmotic laxatives, the water from the blood is basically the blood volume will go down as the volume in the lumen goes up. So as a result, you could cause a drop in blood pressure, and in theory, I guess you could cause dehydration and you know, if you took enough, you probably could cause shock in the person with a drop of blood pressure that could be life-threatening. But that would have to be pretty high dose. Okay. So those are osmotic laxatives. Now the next type of laxative. Oh, sorry. So this is my little picture where those little white circles in the dark blue area represents the solutes, and the little dots on the inside demonstrate there's hypertonicity or hypertonic solution. So there's more salts or dissolved substrates in the interior of that little thing there. And so the water on the outside naturally will flow in there to make sure that it becomes an isotonic solution. Okay. So those are osmotic laxatives. I use osmotic laxatives a lot in clinic, magnesium in particular in clinic for people with chronic constipation or occasional constipation. Okay. Now, there's other things that I do, and I'll talk about that next week, but that's one of the things that I do. Now, another thing that's useful are what are called bulk laxatives. Bulk laxatives basically are high in fiber, and it could be both soluble and insoluble fiber. And what they do is soluble fiber, when you add water to it, it expands, and it helps to expand in the bowel, giving more volume to it. Insoluble fiber to the bowel, I don't think it expands. I think it just doesn't get absorbed, so it just remains there, giving it a bulking agent that way. So the combination of them have a bulking agent in the bowels. And one of the things that your bowels needs in order to promote a bowel movement is, first of all, you need hydration, because appreciate stool is a liquid. It's not a solid. You know, you're not defecating bricks. You're defecating kind of like jello, you know, to varying degrees. And so you need hydration. You also need a bulking agent that helps to give volume to it, because the smooth muscles in the intestines have stretch receptors that, when they expand, it triggers peristalsis. So the bulk laxatives helps to give the volume required to give a signal to get things moving along. And so the fiber helps to stimulate the stretch receptors. It absorbs water, helping to make it more malleable. Like, you want it to be softer, but not too soft as well. And so that's the main mechanism how it works. Now, in general, a diet rich in plant material will have lots of bulk laxative bulking agents in there. Okay, so if someone's eating a plant-based diet, chances are they're probably going to be getting enough of this. Now, if not, you can get patients to supplement their diet with something like psyllium husk. Okay, and psyllium husk is the main ingredient found in over-the-counter laxatives like Metamucil. I'm not promoting Metamucil. Metamucil has also some flavorings and some other things added to it, but the main medicinal property associated with it is the psyllium husk. And so it absorbs water and has that bulking agent. Now, that's one thing you could do. Another thing you could recommend people do is just have ground flaxseed. A couple tablespoons of ground flaxseed every morning will give better volume to the stool and have that bulking agent and help to promote bowel movement. So it's used more for sluggish bowels and chronic constipation. And just in general health, I don't know precisely what the ideal amount of fiber is in the diet. You know, there's different theories on this. I think the average American diet probably gets very, very small amounts. Like if you're only getting a few grams of fiber a day, it would be a miracle if you're not having some problems having a bowel, with constipation or sluggish bowels. Probably our early ancestors may have been getting between 50 and 100 grams. 80 grams maybe might be where they're at. And so I think we need that. Not only are the bulk laxatives important for maintaining bowel movements, but they're also important for providing a food source for our gut bacteria. And they will ferment the fibers and release short-chain fatty acids, which are important for feeding our enterocytes. So fiber, not only does it act as a laxative, but it helps to feed the good bacteria, which modulates our immune system. And then the good bacteria feed our intestines, which makes them happy as well. So just another reason why a plant-based diet is, whole foods plant-based diet is health promoting, okay? So flax, you've got the fiber in it, which is good for you. You've got the omega-3s in it that are good for you. And you also have those polyphenols we talked about earlier on, which are good for you. Now, as far as I know, only one of those things directly impacts bowels, but I don't, just one second. No. Another thing, just as an aside, I could probably mention that, is stool softeners can be, if you ingest too much oil. So oil in general can have a laxative-like effect. And I guess it could add, it's not really under the herbal medicine thing. But if you consume something like olive oil and you take a few big tablespoons of olive oil, again, like the sugars, if you can't absorb it all, it remains in the bowel. And in that case, it kind of has this lubricating and softening effect. It becomes interspersed amongst the stool, preventing it from becoming impacted. And it helps to kind of coat the outside to give it more lubrication. So drinking a whole bunch of olive oil or fish oil supplements, often people will say that they find that they have looser stools with it, or bulk, it tends to promote better bowel movements. Or eating flaxseed, the oil in that, if you can't absorb it all, that could act as a mild stool softener, assuming you're not absorbing it. Anything that you absorb won't have that impact. So flax, the main indication is that bulk laxative effect, is that how it's going to work on the bowels. Increasing a little bit more oil in your diet, like flaxseed oil, could have that effect. Maybe not enough just from taking a few tablespoons of ground flaxseed, but maybe. And then the third thing is the polyphenols that are in it, those lignans that have all sorts of positive antioxidant effects, they also are metabolized by your gut bacteria. And when you feed your gut bacteria with fiber and polyphenols, more of them grow. And the good bacteria themselves can act as a bulking agent. So probiotics have this bulking, what would be considered a bulk laxative as well. They're not under the herbal medicine realm, but they would be a bulk laxative as well because they bulk up. So sometimes taking a pill of 50 billion or 100 billion or even 15 billion units of certain classes of probiotics will often help promote regular bowel movements. So in addition to flax, chia would do that as well because of the soluble fiber in that. Aloe vera gel, sometimes you can buy it in various drinks and forms. I don't tend to use it very much, but the gel component would have a bulk laxative effect. Now, one caution I want to give you, and these things are important to remember, if nothing else for your exam, but also in private practice, is bulk laxatives should, not in my opinion, be given to people that are acutely constipated. So if you haven't had a bowel movement in a few days, it's not ideal to suddenly take a big few tablespoons of fiber, because what will end up happening is you're already the bowels are slowed down or have stopped almost, or just creeping along. And if you take a big bolus of fiber, then what ends up happening is it expands and it's now trying to get things moving along. And the problem is that with that plug there that's occurring from the compacted stool, it's not going to be able to move at the same rate that the fiber load does. So it starts to expand and bloat, and it's trying to push things along, but it can cause a lot of discomfort, a lot of bloating and gas and cramping pains. And so it's better to stimulate the bowels first with an osmotic laxative or a stimulating laxative in the cases of acute constipation where they haven't had a bowel movement for several days, rather than giving them a whole bunch of fiber. So I would say a bulk laxative is really not recommended during acute constipation, and that's if you haven't had a bowel movement for days. It's more to promote regularity, to ensure that you have regular bowel movements. And as I mentioned earlier, you need water to go along with the fiber. And if you take a bulk laxative without insufficient water, it can actually get stuck. And there are cases where people taking psyllium with insufficient amount of water and swallowing it. And what ends up happening is that fiber starts to expand with the water, but it becomes more like a solid gel rather than a viscous, slimy solution. And there's been case reports of psyllium husk, the husk that's not ground, getting stuck in the esophagus and causing choking, and no one's died from it, I don't think, but I think it can be pretty scary for people if they get this stuck in the esophagus. So the FDA basically warns that people should not be taking unground psyllium husk as a bulk laxative because of that concern of choking. So if you're going to use any kind of bulk laxative, make sure you're drinking adequate amount of water. If you're taking psyllium husk, better to get the ground stuff than the whole husk. You can buy both. And if you do the whole husk, which is fine, I've used that personally as well, you just got to make sure that you take enough water with it, okay? Got a couple questions I'm going to look at here. Can soluble fiber trigger the stress receptors too much and cause distension and discomfort? I would say, yeah, there's you can have too much of anything, right? So if you take more than a tablespoon of, let's say, psyllium husk, psyllium fiber, you will probably feel bloated and distended. The other problem is sometimes there's a bit of an adjustment period where if you take a whole bunch of fiber and your body's not used to it, sometimes people will feel bloated and gassy with it. And it's probably a combination of your body getting used to it, but also your gut bacteria start fermenting the fiber and releasing new gases, and they'll settle down after a little bit. But psyllium definitely can cause a little bit of gas and bloating too much. Ground flaxseed could potentially have that effect. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is that a lot of food sensitivities can cause bloating, cramping, constipation, or diarrhea as a side effect. And so I recommend flax seeds to every single one of my patients, but I would say 1 in 50 people, maybe more than that, maybe less. I really don't know. But occasionally, it's not common, but occasionally somebody will have a sensitivity to the flax or the chia and they have to remove it. And if they remove it, they feel fine, they reintroduce it. And other fiber sources are fine, but flax bugs them. A lot of people react to dairy. Very, very rare do people react to flax or rice. But even rice, which is considered hypoallergenic, is a food that sometimes will cause bloating and distension and things like that. So yes, fiber can cause that symptoms. It usually causes maybe bloating, gas, cramping pains, but those can overlap with food sensitivities. So if someone comes in with that presentation, it could just be that they're taking too much fiber, but it can also be yeast overgrowth in their gut. Maybe they got some kind of bug in their gut that's fermenting sugars. Could also be other things. So, but if you start introducing a new thing like flax or psyllium and they get a lot of bloating and gas, reduce the dose and see if that helps. Okay, start with the lowest amount. So there's a picture of psyllium on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, that's what the flax flower looks like. It's a very pretty little flower. You've seen the seeds before. What's this say? Oh, so the FDA says the final rule establishing the over-the-counter laxative product in granular dose form containing a bulk forming psyllium ingredients, blah, 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 are not generally recognized as safe and effective and are misbranded. The final rule indicates, but is not limited to, any granules that are swallowed dry prior to drinking liquid disperse. So, and the FDA is issuing the final rule after considering reports of esophageal obstruction associated with the use of psyllium laxatives in granular dosage forms. These cases continue to occur despite efforts to promote safety. So that's something to be aware of. I don't generally recommend them in capsule form. I generally recommend that people add them to water, stir it, and then drink it. And you have to be careful with the dose. I don't use psyllium as my primary bulk laxative, but I have used it in the past, and there is definitely a place for it in practice. We'll talk about later on more. So, the last group of laxatives are the stimulating laxatives, and these are probably familiar to most people out there. Senna is probably one of the oldest and well-known stimulating laxatives that can be found in any drugstore. Okay, so Senna and other types of forms like that are what's used, and these are used primarily for acute constipation. You don't want to use these for chronic constipation. The way that they work, I didn't include a picture. So the way that they work is they interact with certain transporters in the lumen of the gut, and they basically stimulate peristalsis and also stimulate the influx of certain ions, sodium ions, in the lumen of the bowel that pulls water in. So they work by having a drug-like effect. So they don't have that osmotic effect or that. So the osmotic effect and the bulk laxatives, it's more of a it's not directly acting on the bowels to have that stimulatory effect. It's more indirectly having more of a physical effect, increasing water through osmosis and bulking, stimulating those stress receptors. These stimulating laxatives are more like a drug-like effect where they target certain transporters, certain proteins in the lumen of the bowels to stimulate their action. Now, stimulating laxative, if it's a really strong one, it'll have a cathartic effect where it fully evacuates the bowels, and that's what cathartic basically means. Now, there are two main classes of stimulating laxatives that are used in herbal medicine. One are the anthraquinone glycosides containing herbs, and then there is non-anthraquinone glycoside containing herbs. Castor oil contains something we'll talk about later on. Its main mechanism is slightly different. It doesn't contain the anthraquinone glycosides that we'll talk about. Senna is the anthraquinones, and it's found in Senna, but it's also found in aloe vera. So when you have aloe vera, the plant, and probably a lot of people have this growing or have had this growing in their homes, when you have the leaf of it and you squeeze out all the gel, that gel could have a bulk laxative effect. It also has a vulnerary effect. You can apply it topically for various skin things, or internally it can have, if you eat it, it can have an immunostimulating or immunomodulating effect because the carbohydrates have an effect on the immune system. So once you've extracted all the gel, the leaf, when it's left over, when it dries, you can scrape out a yellowy type of resin that's in that. And that resin contains anthraquinone glycosides, very similar to those that you find in Senna. So aloe vera, the plant, depending on what part of the leaf you use, could be considered a different drug per se, or a different therapeutic treatment. So the gel is different than the inner resin, and that's why it has to be clarified which part of the plant you're using. So Senna, aloe vera resin, and there's a number of other herbs that are commonly, you can find these in North America, they grow wild around here. A couple different species of buckthorn. Buckthorn grows in kind of swampier, low-lying forests. That would be something that probably early settlers would have used because it grows in this area of North America. Rhubarb root. So rhubarb, the plant, is used as a food, the stalks are, The leaves, just as an aside, are dangerous because they contain oxalic acid, which can cause kidney stones. But the roots contain anthraquinone glycosides. And so both in Chinese medicine, they use rhubarb root in Chinese medicine for as a laxative, and also has some antimicrobial effects as well. I think anthraquinone glycosides and anthraquinones do have some antimicrobial effects, I think. Yellow dock, which is in the same family as rhubarb, the roots of it also contain anthraquinone glycosides. They tend to be less stimulating than, I would say, the senna and the aloe resin and the buckthorns. So both rhubarb and yellow dock are more gentle. It could be the dose or it could be the forms aren't quite as stimulating. Yellow dock is used as a GI tonic. It's used for chronic skin conditions. Has some use as a liver herb as well. So the bottom two might be ones that you could use in formulas that you might give to people for a little longer duration, while I would say senna and aloe resin, you tend to use it more acutely. And those, in general, stimulating laxatives, I think these are designed to be taking short-term, maybe 7 to 10 days maximum. You don't want to exceed that because you can become dependent on stimulating laxatives. So, and what that means is it alters your GI tract so that it develops a dependency on it. Just like if you're taking opiates, eventually your body becomes dependent on it and you need more of them to have the effect. And when you stop taking it, you have rebound symptoms. And so if you suddenly stop taking a stimulating laxative, you would get rebound constipation, even if you didn't need them anymore, okay? But that only tends to occur after a week or two. So short durations, I sometimes recommend these. These are not my go-to, but in some cases, I will say pick up some Senna. I don't use them a lot in tincture form. You could, but I tend to use more of the, just you can go to a local drugstore and pick them up very inexpensively just because it's more cost effective than using it as a tincture. But you could use them. I sometimes look at rhubarb and yellow dock in tincture form. So, okay. So that's the laxatives. Do you guys have any questions? So 3 main actions for the laxatives. Just as an aside, how's the sound quality, visuals at all okay? Am I breaking up at all? All good. Thank you, guys. So we talked about constipation when the bowels are moving too slowly. Now we're going to talk about antidiarrheal. So these are used when people have bowel movements that are too rapid. And so there's a balance there. You don't want your bowels to be too slow, otherwise there's lots of pain and discomfort and you're not eliminating waste and toxins and everything else. But then if they move too quickly, then you have the problem where you could become dehydrated. And dehydration is probably, infantile diarrhea is probably one of the top killers in the world. Obviously in North America, it's not as much of an issue as it is in places like India and probably China and other areas in the tropics where water quality is not as good, so it tends to be more contaminated with microorganisms, and also people have less access to healthcare in those areas. So infantile diarrhea is concerning. Now, most of us, if we go to a third world country and start drinking the tap water, you're probably going to get diarrhea because your body is not used to it. So even if the locals can drink tap water, you may not be able to because we don't have a resistance to the bugs. You could develop it over time if you took small amounts over, if you're planning on living down there and you took small amounts over a period of time, you could develop a tolerance to it. But you'd want to be careful with that. So traveler's diarrhea, you would want to use antidiarrheals, but also other conditions like inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome. Those are all indications where antidiarrheals might be an option. Now I'm going to go through in general later on and talk about diarrhea as a condition and sort of how you might manage it for the various types of condition, what actions and herbs and everything you might want to use, because not everyone who comes in with diarrhea has the same cause. And it's, eventually it sounds like a cliche when you're talking about naturopathic medicine. We always want to treat the root cause, but it's very true when you're dealing with most things, especially with digestive issues. So if you have diarrhea, it could be caused by a food sensitivity. It could be caused because you're taking too much vitamin C. It could be caused because you're taking too much magnesium. It could be caused because you have a parasite or a virus or a bacteria, or you have an autoimmune condition going on, or you have celiac disease. So regardless of the cause, some of these indications could be beneficial, but some of them could also be harmful if you're giving them to someone and they don't need them, okay? So antidiarrheals in general, there's a number of other actions we've discussed, most of these we've discussed so far, that can overlap. And some of these are used in most herbal books and some of them aren't used as much. Now, bulking agents, like the bulk laxative, ironically, I mean, the name doesn't sound like it should, but a bulk laxative can help with diarrhea and it has antidiarrheal properties. And the reason for that is when you take something that's high in fiber, like psyllium husk, for constipation, it absorbs water and expands and stimulates peristalsis. In the case of diarrhea, what it does is it absorbs water and expands, but it helps convert the contents of the lumen of the bowels from liquid into more of a gel. And the benefit of that is you can have better bowel control if you've got stool that's jello than if you have stool that's water. And appreciate, if you put your hand out and you try to pour water into your hand and hold on to it, you won't be able to because the water will just slip through your fingers. But if you pour jello into your hand, you can get better control of that liquid or gel, that is. Okay, you can hold on to a jello, but you can't hold on to water, or pretty difficult to. And so that's why the bulk laxatives tend to have a normalizing effect on the bowels. Obviously, you have to have the right amount, but too little won't really do anything. Too much could, make you feel unwell and bloated and gassy and everything else. So, so maybe a tablespoon of psyllium husk would do the trick, or maybe a couple tablespoons, a couple times a day, might be the right amount, or it could be too much depending on the person. So you want to make sure you get in that right range. So an antidiarrheal is just a general term that includes the bulking agents. It also includes things like astringent herbs may have an antidiarrheal effect. Now, astringents, as we mentioned earlier when we're talking about things like anti-ulcer herbs, if you remember that picture that I showed you of the leg that had been treated with the dragon's blood, the astringent action is responsible for altering the actual structure of the tissues and causing a cross-linking. And so topically, when you add the tannins, it forms that cross-linking with the exposed tissues and makes it tight, pulls it together, and it reduces permeability and creates a protective barrier. Now, if you take a lot of astringent herbs internally, what it can end up doing is it will bind to exposed proteins and certain amino acids, probably the nitrogens, I'm suspecting is what it likes to bind up with. So I think phenolic compounds like to bind with nitrogens and form a cross-linking with them. And so that's why it tends to precipitate these proteins that are floating in solution. So if you have most of the transporters in the lumen of the bowel are probably going to be protein-based structures. And so these tannins will bind to them and potentially inactivate some of these transporters, thereby directly or indirectly affecting the excretion or the ability of them to secrete things. So by affecting these transporters, you're probably going to prevent that major influx of sodium ions in the lumen of the bowel. But also that's going to affect the ability of you to absorb certain things. So these astringent compounds will also prevent the absorption of nutrients if you're taking them in high amounts. So astringents, you got to be careful. They are toxic And if you take too much, you could potentially die from them. We're not designed to handle high amounts of phenolic compounds. Like we couldn't live off a diet of acorns, which come from oak trees, which are very astringent. Squirrels can because they have certain liver enzymes that can break them down better. But we would, if we took pure astringent compounds, they would cause liver and kidney problems in us. So you have to respect, not overdo it. If you've ever had a glass of really oaky, astringent, like a Grand Reserve Rioja wine or an Australian wine that was aged in oak barrels, like when it has that, it makes your mouth pucker up. If you drink that on an empty stomach, you're going to get kind of a gut rot from it. And that's why these astringent things are consumed, generally speaking, with meat, because it binds to the meat so you can enjoy the taste without altering your gastrointestinal tract. Or when black tea is a little bit of milk's added to it, it's to bind up those tannins. The milk proteins bind up with the tannins so that you don't have that effects in the gut. So astringents, I would be more inclined to use it acutely in high amounts if I were to use it for certain types of diarrhea. The other thing that I was going to mention is that some of the enterotoxins that are produced by E. coli and Giardia and the other bugs that cause diarrhea tend to be protein-based. And so the advantage of taking some astringents, and I don't want to scare you away from using astringents in general, but if it's used responsibly, and there's different varying degrees. Some astringents are much stronger than other ones, but if you're using them responsibly as indicated, they can certainly have a positive effect. And when you look at these enterotoxins, I think one of the ways that certain herbs like witch hazel or oak bark or green bananas, which is a folk medicine for diarrhea in the Caribbean, and another herb, geranium, the way that all these guys will work is they can bind to these enterotoxins and alter the permeability of the bowel. And if they bind to the enterotoxins, what happens is they change the structure of them, and now they're going to neutralize them, not allow them to bind, exert their influence on your intestinal tract, if that makes sense. Okay. So that's the astringents. Astringents also have an anti-secretory effect. So I think that some of the benefits of the antacid herbs are related to the astringents because maybe they can bind to some of these proteins and transporters involved with making stomach acid, but also those involved with responsible for increasing the secretion of sodium into the lumen of the bowel. Now, antimotility substances are probably going to be related to a few different mechanisms. If you think about loperamide, which is the Imodium, the drug that's used for diarrhea, the way that it works is it has this antimotility effect because it's an opiate. Now, unlike a lot of other opiates, it doesn't have strong analgesic effect at the therapeutic dosage because it's not well absorbed. So you don't get the high or the pain-relieving effects that you would from opium. But opium was historically used for diarrhea. So in the time when people were suffering from cholera, excuse me, if you didn't suppress the diarrhea, people would die of basically shock. They go into shock because they become dehydrated. Their blood volume would drop so much, their blood pressure would drop, and they go into shock and die. And so there are cases where you need to suppress the diarrhea to prevent dehydration and potentially death. And so opioids can do that. Other things that can do this are things that work on anticholinergics. So things like scopolamine and atropine, those anticholinergics we described earlier on, would have an antimotility effect, could basically shut down peristalsis, suppress peristalsis. And so that might be useful. The disadvantage of using antimotility drugs, one, if you're using opium, obviously there's the addictive issues with it, and also there can be rebound constipation with it. Those are problems. But the other issue that can occur with it is diarrhea is designed, or diarrhea is not designed, sorry. Your body, Mother Nature, God, whoever you want to say, the reason why we get diarrhea is to flush out some kind of offending agent from the GI tract. So there's a therapeutic effect. It's your body's attempts to purge what's on the inside because it's bugging it, right? So most people get traveler's diarrhea. It will go away after a few days. It may be an uncomfortable few days, but it will go away. Sometimes it goes chronic, and then that becomes more problematic. If you eat a food that's you have a sensitivity to, it can cause diarrhea because your body finds it irritating. It's causing some kind of inflammatory response, and it's basically trying to flush it out. So your body knows if it's bad, get rid of it, right? Just like if you eat something that, some kind of poison, often you'll vomit from it. And that's your body's trying to get rid of it. So if you suppress your body's innate mechanism to getting rid of these toxins or these infections, what can happen is these bacteria or the cholera or the parasites or the bacteria or the virus, you're not keeping the count low in the system. So they can end up growing inside your intestinal tract and could cause things like megacolon or could cause severe infections. In some cases, things like dysentery will actually cause like a hemorrhagic diarrhea. And so suppressing the diarrhea in some cases could actually prolong or make it worse. So you have to be careful with that. That being said, if you got to go on, I remember when I was in India, I got a little bout of Giardia, and I took some Imodium because I had to book my bus tickets, and I had Giardia, and I still wasn't totally over it. And I thought, well, you know what? I don't know if there's going to be a bus on the bus or a washroom on the bus, and even if there is, I don't want to be going all the time. So I took a drug to suppress it, just to give me some better bowel control. I was doing other things, but it was something that I did. And so I think there's a place for it. And it's, again, suppressive actions aren't always a bad thing. A little bit of suppression is sometimes needed just to improve quality of life, okay? But a lot of people, I would say, maybe a little bit of psyllium or maybe some green bananas or whatever it may be might be sufficient. You may not have to go to the hardcore drugs for it off the bat. So that's the anti-secretory, anti-motility effects kind of related to these various things. There's other herbs that have that effect as well. Anti-inflammatory, in general, inflammation is usually, not always, usually, or often, I don't want to say usually because in some cases it's not. If you have diarrhea and it's because you took too much magnesium or vitamin C, there is no inflammatory component to it. If you have an infection or a food sensitivity, there's probably going to be some kind of inflammatory component to it. Certain cytokines will stimulate peristalsis. So certain herbs that have an anti-inflammatory effect may indirectly also have some antidiarrheal properties. And then finally, one of the other ways that you can combat diarrhea is through antimicrobials. And antimicrobials are things that target microorganisms. So that's a good segue to the next slide we're going to get to in a second. So there's a few different herbs, but this is only a few things. So golden seal, it has antimicrobial effects, but it also seems to have a slight anti-secretory effect and anti-motility effect. Not very strong, but it's traditionally used for diarrhea and various types of intestinal infections. Psyllium, which is bulk laxative, it's an antidiarrheal. It may also have some anti-secretory effects, very mild ones that are unrelated to the fiber. And then finally, chamomile is in their German herbal tradition, it's often used for a number of children's GI conditions like stomach aches and cramping and colic, but also it has very gentle benefits for infantile diarrhea and can be taken for that. And it may have some anti-secretory effects, anti-inflammatory effects, and a few other mechanisms, and also antispasmodic actions associated with it. So antimicrobials, these are substances that inhibit the growth of microorganisms. So there are lots of different types of microorganisms. There are bacteria, there are worms, there are parasites, there are viruses. and all of them can cause diarrhea. There's at least some bug in each one of the classes that causes diarrhea. So again, antimicrobials is the big umbrella term. Antiparasitics would include, more specifically, antimalarials, Anthelmintics, and antiamoebics. Some herbs don't break it down to that particular order, but some books do. Some books are just general. They call it antimicrobials. It's nice that they're a little bit more specific. There are antibacterial herbs or funguses. Certainly I see people with yeast overgrowth can sometimes get diarrhea with it. And I don't know if it's because of what the immune system is. Generally, yeast doesn't produce enterotoxins that cause diarrhea, but maybe they produce things that just irritate the bowels and that can cause some diarrhea and some upsetting the stool. And then viruses as well. So antiseptics are different than antibiotics in the sense that antiseptics don't tend to target specific proteins, enzymes in the body. So when you take an antibiotic, it'll affect this particular enzyme in that microorganism and exert its influence through that. And if the bacteria doesn't have that particular enzyme, it won't have any effect on it usually, or minimal effect anyways. It could affect it through other mechanisms, but not through that mechanism. So antiseptics, rather than targeting a very specific protein, it just has a general irritating effect. And so things that are rich in essential oils, or just extracted essential oils like tea tree oil, oregano oil, the way that they work is those essential oils tend to disrupt cell membranes and make the microorganism more susceptible to breaking apart lysis, basically disrupting the cell membrane, and that can weaken them, and that can also make them more susceptible to immune cells. It can also disrupt biofilms, which is a mechanism, a defense mechanism sometimes we use to create like a little gelatinous force field around themselves so that they can evade drugs and the immune system. And so a lot of herbs have those essential oils that can have that antiseptic effect. Presumably, these antiseptics, in small amounts, we can certainly handle them, but there are other things called disinfectants, which will kill microorganisms, but generally are not safe for human consumption. So when you start, you wouldn't go and drink bleach or ozone, high amounts of iodine, you probably wouldn't want to do, but I mean, a small amount, it's all dose dependent as well, right? So I mean, a little bit of bleach wouldn't kill you, but lots of it would. So those are antiseptics. If you see those in a book, you'll understand that. Antibacterial, there's lots of them. Now, one of the things with the antibacterials, antifungals, antiparasitics is there's overlap. So myrrh is a great antibacterial herb, but it also has antiparasitic effects. It also has antifungal effects. It also has antiviral effects, I think. So I don't know which one is better for it. The nice thing about herbs is they tend to be less specific in their action and have more broad spectrum properties to it. Myrrh contains a certain group of sesquiterpene compounds that may be responsible for the antimicrobial effect. There's some essential oils in that as well. Golden seal contains the isoquinoline alkaloids, like Oregon grape and barberry. They all kind of work by the same mechanism. They seem to have a broad spectrum effect, including an antibacterial. Garlic also has a bunch of sulfur compounds that have an effect. Podarco and its South American cousin, Podarco and its North American cousin, black walnut, have naphthoquinones in it. So these all have different groups of antimicrobials that have effects on bacteria. Some of them will have effects on antifungal effects as well. I didn't really list them all here. And then antiparasitic ones, as I mentioned, there are a few different types of parasites that you can have. Antiprotozoals, so malaria is a protozoal bug that causes, malaria, did I say that? Malaria causes malaria. Diarrhea causes a type of infectious diarrhea. I've had that, it's awful. Also called beaver fever. I got it in India where there's no beavers, so and that was my own fault because I went swimming in the Ganges, which seemed like a nice, good idea to do until I found out raw sewage was being dumped into the water like 2 kilometers up. But anyways, amoebic dysentery, which we don't see. I've never seen it practice, but it definitely is out there. Certainly in North America, that was an issue a long time ago, but less so now. Leishmaniasis doesn't cause diarrhea, but causes severe skin issues. I've seen it down in the Amazon, people with it. Chagas disease is another South American parasite. And then trichomonas is a type of vaginal infection caused by a parasite as well. So often the herbs that work on these, there could be overlap. I know golden seal, for example, can target Giardia and amoeba. It also seems to have a positive effect on trichomonas. And there may be benefits of berberine, the active ingredient against malaria as well, which just doesn't surprise me because berberine is an isoquinoline alkaloid, and it's very similar to quinine, which is a quinoline alkaloid. Okay? So Anthelmintics, this comes from the term meaning anti-helminth. So a helminth is a worm. So Anthelmintics basically kill worms. So sometimes when people say, oh, someone has a parasite, that term can be, it may not be entirely accurate just in the general sense of a parasite. It could be an actual bacteria, not a parasite causing the problem. But pinworms, hookworms, and tapeworms are common infections. You see it more in the tropics. If you go down to Mexico, you can buy a lot of anthelmintic drugs over the counter. Many of the herbs that we use could affect this. I don't know how they do head-to-head versus the drugs. Some of the better anthelmintic herbs can be a little bit toxic. You've got to be careful with it, but let's look at the drugs. Now, if you're reading a book and it says something is a vermifuge is a type of anthelmintic that stuns the worms, while a vermicide kills the worm. So the way that some of these guys work is they'll actually directly kill it, while some of them will just sort of like stun them a bit, and then you purge it with some stimulating laxative to try to evacuate the bowels and get rid of the bug. Okay. Another action that's worth mentioning, which is kind of related to the antimicrobials, is antiadherence. And so an antiadherent herb is going to have antimicrobial effects, but the way it works is rather than maybe directly killing the bug, it binds to surface, little proteins on the surface or glycoproteins on the surface of the bugs, and prevents them from adhering to our mucosal or mucous membranes. So to give you an idea here, I think I've shown you this slide before, there are little adhesins on the tentacles. I mean, this is sort of my artistic rendition of a bacteria, but you know, it's like a little space alien octopus where you've got these little suction cups that allow it to attach to your mucosa. But if you take some adherence agent, and that could be things like cranberry juice, which helps to prevent E. coli from attaching to the mucosa in the urinary tract. But cranberry, also has benefits for preventing gingivitis because it binds to these adhesins on some of the bacteria that cause gingivitis. Or blueberries and cranberries might help reduce the risk of stomach ulcers caused by H. pylori because it might bind to that. And I think that in general, both just astringent herbs and also just polyphenols in your diet that are found in berries and various fruits. So it's probably going to be some of the astringent compounds that you might get from the tannins that are either hydrolyzable or the non-hydrolyzable tannins. So the non-hydrolyzable tannins are the anthocyanins, that blue color that you get in berries and the red color that you get in berries. Those probably will bind to these bacteria to prevent infection. Certainly when we look at one of the ways that, for example, elderberry and elderflowers works to reduce cold, the duration and the intensity of cold symptoms, is it has an immunostimulating effect, but it also has an anti-adherence effect and may bind up the viruses that cause certain types of colds, upper respiratory tract infections, and prevent them from binding to your mucosa. And so the first stage of infection is it has to basically attach onto the mucosa before it can invade it. Okay, so if you prevent it from landing and attaching, then it just gets flushed through the system and won't have this effect. Okay. So what did I write here? So in addition to the tannins, sometimes certain carbohydrates can have that anti-adherence effects, and those are found in things like licorice, okra, cranberry and blueberries have certain types of compounds that'll bind it up. Mucilage in general, I think, mucilaginous herbs can protect the mucous membranes by creating that nice slimy coating that might actually bind to the feed of these bacteria as well. Okay. There's a question I'll get back to in a second there. Anti-inflammatory herbs. Most plants have anti-inflammatory properties associated with it. So if you're eating a diet that's rich in fruits, vegetables, and spices, and coffee, and tea, and herbal teas, you're going to be getting anti-inflammatory compounds in your diet. Phenolic compounds in general, which are rich in a plant-based diet, have anti-inflammatory effects, okay? Some classic anti-inflammatory herbs often used in the gut: turmeric, ginger, frankincense, Indian frankincense, English plantain are all commonly used. And the way that these guys work by a few different mechanisms. On your left here, this is a cell membrane, and the cell membrane has phospholipids. That's a picture of a phospholipid. You don't need those for the exam. I just like to show this. Because I have a biochemistry background, I like trying to understand how things work. So this is one of the processes for inflammation. So phospholipase cleaves off a fatty acid. In this case, it's arachidonic acid, or it could be the linoleic acid. That's linoleic acid. What is it? Anyways, the omega-6 fatty acids, or arachidonic acid, that can then be run through the enzyme cyclooxygenase or lipoxygenase to make either certain prostaglandins or leukotrienes that are involved in the inflammatory process. Okay? And so that's kind of what inflammation is all about. But now there are different enzymes and specific spots that perpetuate inflammation. So cortisol has this inhibitory effect on the conversion of phospholipids to the arachidonic acid. So cortisol targets that. I bet you a lot of the adaptogens probably have some effect on that as well. We know that willow bark, salicylic acid, that comes from a lot of fruits and vegetables, and in particular willow bark, will target cyclooxygenase. So do a number of other herbs to varying degrees. But if you look at something like curcumin, it'll affect COX enzyme. It affects this nitric oxide synthase, which is also contributes to inflammation. It may affect the formation of tumor necrosis factor, interleukins that perpetuate inflammation. Rosmarinic acid, which is found in a few herbs, including rosemary, affects some of the complement system. So this is not like I haven't covered every single herb and every single mechanism all these herbs have. But what I like about this is when you're doing herbal medicine, you're combining a few different herbs. They may work synergistically because they're targeting the different enzymes. So you don't have to memorize that. Please don't do that at all, because I just did my best when I created this to try to find a few different mechanisms. The take home is, if you take ibuprofen, you're only affecting one of these enzymes, cyclooxygenase, and then you develop side effects. But if you're taking herbs and you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables and you're avoiding, another thing you can do is if you're having high amounts of omega-3s and less of the omega-6s, then you're producing less of these precursors that lead to the formation of prostaglandins that go through this as well. Okay, so I think that's just kind of a cool explanation of how the different ways that you can target inflammation using herbs. Anna has a question. What about using a strong probiotic for traveler's diarrhea? So you can take bacteria, good bacteria. The research shows that it appears to inhibit or reduce the risk of contracting traveler's diarrhea. And if you have traveler's diarrhea and you're taking a probiotic, I think that it should accelerate the recovery. Usually the good bacteria, whether you take it as a supplement or the ones living in your gut, they do things, they create things that can inhibit the growth of bacteria. And some probiotics would probably have a greater, would be more effective than other ones. And it could be strain specific. So it could be the same genus and species, but there may be a particular strain that's really effective because it has the right little protein to target this bug in particular. So lots of research in that. In general, I think taking a probiotic supplement at a relatively high dose is probably a good thing to do when you're traveling, because if you're taking an extra 50 billion, units of bacteria per day when you're traveling, what that means is there's 50 billion bugs that are now potentially competing against a small amount of bacteria that could be sneaking into your water. Like if someone puts an ice cube in it that may have been contaminated, or they rinsed your salad with some local water, had a little bit of fecal matter in it, then at least there's a good chance that you could be competing it. So when I travel to places where I'm concerned with getting a bug, then I would definitely consider taking a probiotic. I don't know, I'm sure it must, but I don't know what the actual stats are as a primary treatment for treating diarrhea. I know that there are benefits for certain strains for Clostridium difficile. I know that, what's that one called? Saccharomyces boulardii, which is technically not a probiotic. It's actually a yeast that doesn't colonize the gut, but it's kind of thrown under the umbrella of the probiotic. It's got some good research for a few different types of travelers' diarrhea because it produces bugs that are toxins that help to fight off these bugs. But it doesn't colonize the gut, so the benefits of it only persists as long as you're supplementing with it, and it won't actually colonize the gut. Most probiotics are like that, because if you don't change the food that they're getting, and you need to have, basically for a probiotic to live in the gut, it needs to have a house and it needs to have a food supply. If the houses have already been filled up by bugs that are already living in your gut, they won't be able to move in. They can just visit your bowels and then just exit, but they won't actually stay there. So unless someone takes antibiotics and totally clears it, or you have some really aggressive probiotic, it's not going to be able to get in there. And if you're eating exclusively McDonald's all the time, you could end up starving out the good bacteria that are living in those homes, and they could die off, and then that would give an opportunity for some new, probably undesirable bug to move in. So eating a whole foods plant-based diet, you're going to be feeding the good bacteria, and if you take antibiotics, it's probably good to take some probiotics, because you're going to be clearing out some homes that some new bugs could sneak into if you're not careful. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break here, and then we'll come back and we'll go through some of the select herbs for the GI tract. If you guys have any questions, please write them down. Okay. sorry, it took me a little longer to get started. My batteries in my mouse are dying, so I was scrambling around trying to get some batteries there. So Laura sent me a little text. I don't know if you saw it. I remember reading last summer about the detrimental effects of taking probiotics in pill form as opposed to eating naturally fermented foods. Some of my friends, avid users of commercial pill probiotics, also developed SIBO. That was my conclusion according to the symptoms they described. Apparently, the pill probiotics do not have an adequate colony population and proportion, and that leads to imbalance. And then provide a link there. So I'm going to look at that link in a second. I think that you could get, so when I look at how many people we recommend probiotics to in the clinic over the years, I don't think I've ever seen anyone develop SIBO as a result of the probiotics. I have seen people experience some increased bloating and stuff like that, that once they discontinued it, went away. So I don't know. I'm going to read I don't want to comment without looking at the full research. I have heard that probiotics, in theory, could cause SIBO, and what SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So I think it's fair to say that that could be a risk in certain people, depending on what they're taking and the dose and everything else. But it's not very common. And I think there's risks associated with everything that we do. I take a probiotic every day, and I've never had any issues at all with SIBO. So, but that's one person. So again, we got to look at the research on this. I think they're good. My concern with fermented foods is a lot of the fermented foods, if you're using yeast-based ones, I'm not crazy about that. I don't know. I like fermented foods. I like sauerkraut, but I can't eat sauerkraut every day, and I'm certainly not eating dirt every day. I don't do dairy, like lactose or yogurts and stuff. The concern with that is that you're increasing your dairy consumption. There's health concerns with that. There's food sensitivity, so it's tricky to navigate. How do you get enough, and what is the right numbers? And I don't have those answers. So, but those are all good, certainly good things to think about. Someone's asking me for the millionth time. I know, I'm sorry. Go over the herbs we need to know for the scientific names for the final. That will be very easy for me. So, if we look at, for exam purposes, we will be talking about the following herbs. So however many herbs are from slide 60 from here all the way down to the bottom to slide 101 on the slides here. So everything I'm going to be talking about for the next hour, those herbs are going to be fair game to know the genus and species. And what I'm going to do is give you an example. Is say gentian or yellow gentian, whichever term I use, because I could use a couple of them. The following is the Latin name for it. Is it A, Gentiana lutea? Is it B, Centaurum erythraea? Is it C, Gentian passiflora? Is it D, whatever, Hydrastis canadensis? And then you choose one of them. And there's 5 questions on your roughly 70 question final exam on that. So, not hard. There's like 30 of them or 40 of them you got to know. I don't know how many exactly. And it's very clear. From now to the end of this PDF file, those are the ones you have to know and no other ones. Okay? You good with that now? The And Laura, the other thing is like kombucha is something that people are doing a lot. I've had a lot of people develop issues with kombucha. I don't know what's in it. I'm not a big fan of it. It's not well researched. It seems to aggravate a lot of patients. I get them off of it. If it works for you, go for it. But it's hard to find fermented foods that are good. If you can send me a list of things that you like, let me know. Okay. So moving on to the herbs for the GI tract. So this isn't new stuff. I think most of these herbs I've already discussed in the phytochemicals, in the herbal actions. Some of them might have appeared in the GI tract. And I'm covering the majority of the herbs. I'm going to talk about them a little bit in more detail, each one of these ones moving forward, and give you a little bit more information. These herbs, you can read about the monographs in books like written by Hoffman or any of the Kerry Bone ones, or Chris Pickrell, who teaches second, third year. He's got a textbook as well, which I think is pretty good. And so any of those are places where you can go into more detail. I like reading about herbs from a few different sources. It gives me an appreciation of it. When you're learning about herbs, there could be dozens of indications for a herb. And the same herb used in a different part of the world might have different emphasis on some of the actions. The research may only support with, let's say, in vitro or in vivo trials, a couple things, or there may be some human trials supporting a couple of the other indications. So sometimes a herb could be useful for lots of different things, but depending on what resource or what study you look at, you may focus on one indication rather than other ones. And so my advice, I'm going to talk about these. I can't talk about every single thing about it. Eventually you want to learn the herbs that you're using a lot in practice. You want to read about and be very familiar with them. I would say that in practice, like we have a dispensary in the back, really probably 30 herbs or 20 herbs are what I use 80% of the time, for sure in practice. Like I'm going to talk about a bunch of herbs. I don't use every single herb that is out there because I've got one that does exactly the same thing. I don't need to buy both, okay? And I'll explain that when I go through them. So, with regards to selected herbs, I didn't cover every single herb. There are lots of great herbs that I'm not going to be discussing, just because there's only so many herbs you guys need to know in practice. Now, the first herb I'm going to talk about is gentian, Gentiana lutea. So again, you need to know the genus and species for this one. This herb has a number of phytochemicals in it responsible for its medicinal actions. I think the main compound responsible for its bitter taste is the amarogentin. Now, you don't need to know the name of amarogentin. I mean, it's pretty easy to deduce from the name that it comes from gentian, but it's a secoiridoid. That's one of those monoterpene lactones. So I may say on the exam, the main bitter component associated with gentian is A, secoiridoids, or the main active ingredient in gentian, or which the following phytochemicals found in gentian. I might ask you that. I won't do all the questions like that, but there might be a couple like that. Gentian is a herb that grows in the Alps in Europe. Has a long history of use in herbal medicine. It's found in a lot of different liqueurs that people consume recreationally and also as a medicine. It's a great herb. I use this one daily or at least numerous times a week with patients. That digestive bitter is considered to be a really good pure bitter that's very beneficial. It's the main active ingredient in Angostura bitters. You can find a bottle of that in almost every single, I don't think I have a picture of here, almost every single bar will have that in it. Also other herbs like, there are other drinks from the LCBO that contain it. But I don't know exactly because they're always very secret about the recipes. So if all you remember is gentian contains bitters and it contains the secoiridoids, you could deduce everything else I'm going to talk about. Now the bitter or the bold things that I've highlighted here are kind of the main indications that you have to know. Because it's a bitter, it increases saliva production, which is a silagogue. It has an affinity to help the stomach work better, so it's stomachic. It gets the liver to make more bile and for the gallbladder to release more bile, so it's a cholagogue choleretic. It has an affinity for the liver because of those actions. It's a hepatic. It also helps protect the liver. There's been research studies that I've seen that it has a hepatoprotective effect, helping protect it from various liver toxins or toxins that affect the liver. When I learned about gentian, I wasn't really aware of that, but this is where some of the in vitro and in vivo studies sort of confirm some of these other indications. We also, one of the things that I found was interesting is it helps to inhibit things like stomach cancer, esophageal cancer, and liver cancer as well through some mechanism. And also, it has some antimicrobial effects. I don't think that's the indication that's emphasized in Western herbalism, but in traditional Chinese medicine, different varieties of gentian are used, like Tibetan gentian and some of the other ones that are used for clearing heat, and heat is associated with inflammation and infection, and as a bitter. And I suspect that the compounds in gentian, yellow gentian, will also have that property as well. Now, the yellow color that comes from yellow gentian, you can see it in the tincture. I suspect that that comes from a number of the flavonoids that are in there as well. And those are probably responsible for some of the antioxidant effects and hepatoprotective effects that it has, and anti-cancer, antioxidant, hepatoprotective effects. So I didn't mention them here because I think flavonoids exist in almost every single plant. So, and it is an important source of those flavonoids, but the main medicinal property that I'm using gentian for is that strong bitter taste that comes from those secoiridoids, okay? What's beautiful about gentian is you literally could use one drop and it would be enough to stimulate the digestive juices, okay? It's extremely bitter. Another thing that I would mention about is what's cool about it is I've used it for people during weight loss, and it appears to have a positive effect for reducing sugar cravings. And one of the ways that it might work with that is sweet and bitter are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And most people who have a bit of a sweet tooth, they tend to shy away from bitter things. And so they don't tend to have black coffee. They don't tend to like bitter greens. They tend to have a palate more like a child, basically, where they desire really, really sweet things. And so by giving them something like gentian to take 3 times a day, it can rewire those taste buds and really kind of shock them. And sometimes I have to get them to do it gradually because they find it to be a little bit offensive. But giving them a few drops of this before meals can shift that bittersweet taste buds so that suddenly things that are sweet that they used to eat, like a candy bar, relatively speaking, it tastes sweeter than it did before, so they don't need as much. They have a little bit more of an aversion. It kind of helps to tweak things a bit. And so by giving people gentian, the other thing that it does is it tends to reduce caloric intake in groups of people and lead to weight loss. And there's a clinical trial that I saw that had been done with that, which is kind of neat. So it's not because it's increasing metabolism or anything else, but it helps to make people more satiated. I find certain foods like if you eat at McDonald's or you have sweet things, it's like you don't stop eating, you just keep poking it in. Like, I don't know what it is with sugary, salty, fatty foods from the fast food and the food industry, but it makes you overeat. And I find bitter things somehow, they promote digestion, but they must affect some of the digestive hormones involved with making you feel satiated. So I think gentian is a great tool for weight loss. There's also studies that show that it has a positive effect on cardiovascular disease profiles, and so it might have some benefits for balancing blood sugar and cholesterol, and may also help with heart disease. So this, I also, even though I'm primarily discussing it as a digestive herb, I think it has the potential to be beneficial for other conditions outside that. I think it can help with skin things because it helps break down food. Indirectly, it'll get the bowels working better. It can probably clean the blood out a little bit. It has some anti-inflammatory effects as well. So I love this herb. It's one of my favorite ones, and we buy it. And what I love about it is I can give someone a very small bottle of it, and it works great. Now, I didn't list the indications for it. I only listed the actions. And the reason why I did that was because you can deduce what it's for. So the primary indications for gentian is going to be for digestive upset, indigestion. And you can write all this down and add it to your notes. But you can deduce that because it's a bitter, it's going to be used for digestion. So it's going to increase appetite, stimulate digestion. It can also be used for issues where you've got a sluggish gallbladder. So people who've got biliary sludge, so sludge in the gallbladder, or gallstones, it can be used for that as well. People with chronic liver issues, it may have a beneficial effects. Can have that hepatoprotective effect, get things moving in there. So people with fatty liver disease, I would use this in the formula for it as well. And because it stimulates digestion and has that protective effect in the stomach, it might be beneficial for helping with reflux, for example. So when people have heartburn and reflux, it helps to tighten up the lower esophageal sphincter and encourages the descent of food. And because it helps to coat the esophagus with saliva and tighten up that sphincter, it can be used for conditions like heartburn or reflux. Now, the only thing you have to watch out with most of these bitters is that if you had H. pylori, or if there is some anatomical issue with scarring of the lower esophageal sphincter where it can't properly close, by giving a bitter, it will stimulate acid, and it could make certain types of heartburn worse, but it's uncommon. So my advice is, don't worry about it too much. Warn the patient, get informed consent. If you really think they have H. pylori, then don't start with it. But if you're pretty confident they don't, start with it. If it gets worse, tell them to stop it, and then that gives us some useful information. What else can I say about gentian? Beautiful herb. I think that this is a herb. So as I said, digestive issues, atonic digestion. So elderly patients tend to have everything kind of becomes less toned and sluggish as you get older. And so digestive bitters and liqueurs are in particular indicated for elderly patients to help get things stimulated and working better as well. And so I would say giving a small bottle to an elderly patient to take before meals wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, if they're eating lots of bitter leafy greens, they wouldn't need it. If you're having a cup of coffee in the morning, maybe you don't need it, but black coffee, that is. But for the other meals, it could be beneficial. So indigestion, heartburn, bloating, lots of excessive burping, which could be due to hypochlorhydria, low stomach acid because the digestive tract's not stimulated, would all be good indications, okay? So what if the patient has long-term acid reflux because of lower esophageal sphincter sluggishness? Is gentian good? I think gentian is indicated for that type in particular, for sure. I would give it 100% for that person. And so I've had people on proton pump inhibitors, which is the main drug used for heartburn and a lot of digestive issues. And often I can wean them off that and give them gentian. They do have opposing actions. One suppresses stomach acid, one stimulates it. So generally speaking, I might get that person to shift when they take those drugs. And I often will give, if someone has heartburn, if I'm not sure what's going on, combine it with a demulcent, and I'll talk about that later on. I generally give this to people in tincture form. You can get anywhere between a 30 ml bottle to a liter bottle of herbs at the clinic. We don't sell it very expensive. We make it pretty cost effective for people. But a little 30 ml bottle of this could last someone weeks if they're taking just a few drops. Now, there is the recommended dosage range for it, but I find this is one herb where I often will go lower than the recommended dosage or dose because it works even at like literally 1 drop a day, but you can go higher than that as well. Okay. Now, another herb I'm going to mention that is called Greater Centauri or Centauri, Centurium erythraea. Now, that herb is in the gentian family. So, Gentianaceae family has gentian, so yellow gentian, but it also has some of the ones in Asian medicine that I mentioned earlier on. And it also includes, so different ones in the same genus, so different species are used around the world, and I would say they're used for the same purposes, and they have very similar phytochemicals. Greater Centauri or Centauri is in the same family. It's a different genus and species, but different genus. But it has pretty much the exact same indications of gentian as gentian has, and it has the same phytochemicals in it. So I'm not going to teach it as a separate herb. I'm just going to tell you that you can read the monographs on each one, but they're identical, okay, in my opinion. I mean, any differences between them is probably just because the author didn't add something in there. But I think you could just replace these one for one, just like you could replace, peppermint and spearmint and some of the other herbs in the mint family. There might be subtle differences, but they're so close that I would say just remember that they're the same. The pictures I've got here, unfortunately, I've never been able to catch either one of those in bloom. So those are 2 pictures. When I've seen yellow gentian in a couple herb gardens. That one I took in Montreal has a nice herb garden, and I've taken them in other herb gardens, but they're either, I just missed that window because they tend to flower in the spring, and I've never been able to catch them, and I can't grow it myself for some reason. But so, anyways, great herbs, and those are my favorite bitters, I think. How long do you recommend it for? You could recommend it for someone taking the entire life. I really don't think that this is a herb that I don't think there's any safety concerns with taking it long term, assuming they don't have like H. pylori or some aggravation from it. I think this is has some health benefits. And if you're doing small dose when you're older, I think that would be totally fine to do. So I don't, generally speaking, most people take it for a period of time. Like, let's say if you have digestive issues, you take it for a period of time, your digestive symptoms and your bloating and everything goes away, and your heartburn goes away. People generally stop doing it on their own. Could be weeks, could be months, okay? But you could take it just for health promotion reasons, small amounts daily, and I wouldn't see that being an issue, okay? Now, unlike golden seal, which I have some reservations about doing it long term, okay? So golden seal's considered, it's a digestive bitter, and it's called the king of the mucous membranes. It's one of the names that some of the early eclectic herbalists would call it, and doctors would call it. This is a herb that grows in Canada and the US exclusively. So golden seal, if you look at the Latin name, is Hydrastis canadensis. And the reason why is that, 1, it grows in Canada, but 2, the leaf that it has looks a little bit like a maple leaf. Now, this is probably one of my favorite antimicrobial herbs. It is also a really good digestive bitter. This is not my first choice as a digestive bitter. I would prefer to use gentian, but it's nice because if I'm treating an infection, I don't know what I'm treating, I get that added side benefit of it being a great digestive bitter as well as being an antimicrobial. So its main activity that I'm using this for, selecting it for, is as an antibacterial, antifungal, antiparasitic. We mentioned earlier, it also has that multi-drug resistant pump inhibitor. And so it may have benefits when used by itself, or if you combined it with other antibiotics, it could have a synergistic effect to it. Now, golden seal is used in practice mostly for conditions of the gastrointestinal tract. So with things like certain types of infectious diarrhea would be a good indication for that. You could use it for, in combination with other herbs for H. pylori infections or infections in the intestinal, in the stomach. It can also be used for conditions associated with the respiratory tract. So with bacterial sinusitis, so it's often used for sinusitis, upper respiratory tract infections, for tonsillitis, conditions like that. So your main indications, your antimicrobials, and it seems to have broad spectrum effects against bacteria, viruses, funguses, parasites. I've used it for, it's often used in my combination for intestinal candidiasis. So if I suspect, if a woman comes in who has frequent vaginal yeast infections, and I suspect that they have yeast overgrowth in the gut, then I would give this orally with some other herbs, or a formula there's another formula that I use that contains berberine as well, from a Chinese formula that I often use in tablet form as well. And you can have that effect. The main active ingredients that you get is a hydrastine, which is kind of unique, or at least has higher amounts of golden seal than you'll get in some of the other herbs. And berberine, which is also found in barberry, Oregon grape, coptis, which is a Chinese herb, all contain berberine. But hydrastine, which is a little more elevated or higher amounts in the golden seal, which I don't know, but I think golden seal is more therapeutically effective than barberry and Oregon grape. That's kind of my opinion. I could be wrong. The other thing about golden seal, that it may have a bit of an antidiarrheal effect by having some anti-secretory effects. So the hydrastine may, or maybe it's the berberine, I'm not sure, may kind of help to decrease diarrhea, one, by targeting the bugs that cause it, but two, maybe it affects some of the enzymes involved or transporters involved with diarrhea and increasing the influx of ions into it. I don't know for certain, but I suspect. So when you look at the indication, it does have that traditional indication for infectious diarrhea. If you remember quinine, which is the quinine alkaloid, it's very, very bitter, and that's what's in tonic water. Golden seal contains berberine and hydrastine, which are isoquinone alkaloids, which are also very bitter. So like I mentioned before, that will give you that antimicrobial and also that digestive bitter effect. Now, my concern with giving golden seal every day, long term, or giving hydrastine or berberine in isolated form is the structure of that. In my opinion, when you have aromatic compounds that contain nitrogens, these guys have the potential, I think, to slip in between your DNA molecules and disrupt it. And so there could be the potential to have carcinogenic effects when taken in high amounts long term, in my opinion. And that, I don't know if this is true. I've seen some studies done in like test tubes and done in animals that suggest that long-term use of this could have a carcinogenic effect. While I'm not really concerned with that with the gentian, but there's no human trials that confirm that, but I get a little bit uneasy. We do know that it's contraindicated during pregnancy, and I would be cautious with most really bitter things during pregnancy. A little bit of coffee you can do, but you don't want to overdo coffee for other reasons as well. But gentian and golden seal, and more so with golden seal, it's like a really strict indication that you wouldn't want to do that. And that's because I think these berberine compounds, the quinine and the isoquinones, could be sliding in between the base pairs and disrupting that, okay? And when you have a baby forming, you don't want to do that. So I love golden seal. I wouldn't be concerned about giving it for several weeks or even a couple months in a non-pregnant woman, but I would be very cautious to give it during pregnancy, or even a woman who is not practicing safe sex or is not taking some form of birth control, or other than some responsible birth control. I would be reluctant to recommend it without giving or really explaining that potential risk for it. So that's golden seal for you. So great herb, primarily as a antimicrobial, secondary as a bitter. Now, if I was living somewhere and I had access to golden seal and I didn't have, and if I was a First Nations person, golden seal was growing in my backyard and I didn't have gentian, then I would use small amounts of this as a digestive bitter. Just respecting that the dose, I wouldn't want to use too much of it long term. Okay. So barberry, there's several different species of barberry that grows around the world. Berberis vulgaris means common in Latin. So Berberis vulgaris is the common variety of barberry that grows in Europe. Okay, and there are different ornamental ones that grow in people's gardens that are different genus and species. You can find barberry all around the world. The berries themselves are often used in Middle Eastern, African cooking as well. It has a bit of a sour tartness to it. You can find it in certain Ethiopian dishes, for example, will have used barberries, and there's other ones. Probably there are not a lot of, I don't think the antimicrobial effects are associated with the berries. It's mostly going to be with the roots. And so barberry and also Oregon grape, which I didn't even include here, they are, in my opinion, almost identical to golden seal, but a lesser version. The benefit of barberry and Oregon grape over golden seal is, if I go back to golden seal, is these guys, the roots are used, but it takes about 3 or 4 years for the plant to mature to the point where you can use the roots. And once you harvest the plant, you no longer get any more, you have to plant the seeds again. So something like golden seal has the risk of being over harvested in the wild, and it's hard to find. I haven't had a lot of success finding it in the wild, just because once you pick it, you lose the plant. Unlike, oops, I'm going the wrong way, sorry, barberry, where you don't have to destroy the entire plant. You can just cut up parts of the root or parts of the branches. I don't remember which part they use. But you could just use some of it without having to kill the entire plant. Now, the main active ingredient in this is berberine and also that 5-MHC, that flavonolignin that has the antimicrobial or the multi-drug resistant pump inhibitor effects. Also, don't forget, flavonolignans are the main compounds in milk thistle that have the hepatoprotective effect. And although I didn't list that here, and you could list this here, and you could deduce it just by knowing it has flavonolignans, barberry has also been shown to have some hepatoprotective effect, and there's some studies that suggest that. So not my main indication for it. I prefer to use other things, because sometimes these isoquinoline alkaloids, I think bugs can potentially disrupt some liver things. We know that from a couple other herbs we'll talk about later on, that it could be irritating to the liver. You could get a drug-induced hepatitis from some of them, and I don't know if that applies with berberry, and I haven't looked at it. Again, what is berberry aristata? I think that is the one that grows in Asia or the Middle East. I'm going to look it up because I'm curious. Berberine aristata. I guess you could have Googled it yourself, but so that is Indian barberry or tree turmeric. So it's just a family. It's from grows in the Himalayas, and it says, according to Wikipedia, well, it contains berberine. So it doesn't go into any major detail. Oh, there it is. Uses. It's used as a dye because of the yellow color of it, so that's where it's used for that. Yeah, they don't give an indication, but it's rich in berberine. That's where it's from. So sometimes the berberine that might be used commercially might actually be coming from Asian varieties because it may be more cost effective. And they also work. I don't think they're inferior. So Berberis vulgaris is the European variety, though. So Boldo is an interesting herb. Now, in South America and Central America, you can often see this sold as a tea, specifically as a digestive tonic and also as a, in particular for uh, gallstones. Now, I did not mention that gentian and golden seal are antilithics. They are antilithics in my opinion. Okay, so if you want to add in gentian and say it's an antilithic, you certainly can do that. And I would say that's correct. Some books will mention that, some books won't. I think that the problem is I'm trying to give you a bunch of stuff and you have to be able, you can't just memorize everything. If you remember it's a bitter, you're going to know it's a silagog, stomachic, cholagogue, choleritic, and a hepatic, maybe hepatoprotective. That one you would be able to figure out. Maybe anti-cancer, but you wouldn't be able to figure that out just from being a bitter necessarily, although it wouldn't surprise me. And most bitter things are usually antimicrobial, but you wouldn't necessarily guarantee that. But with a digestive bitter, you're going to get all those silagog, stomachic, cholagogue, choleritic, and even a mild laxative effect. And because it increases bile flow, it's going to have an antilithic effect. So I would say gentian, golden seal, barberry, and boldo all have antilithic effects. But often when some of the books talk about boldo, its primary indication that comes out as being an antilithic for gallstones. So boldo is like a classic herbal remedy for gallstones. It has boldine, which is an isoquinoline alkaloid. If you look at the structure of the boldine there, and then we go back, oops, where am I going? Sorry, my mouse. If you look at the berberine or you look at the hydrastine, they all have that isoquinoline structure to it, okay? So isoquinolines are going to be bitter. So how is it working as a antilithic? Presumably as a cholagogue and choleritic, right? Because it's bitter effects. Now, it also has some interesting essential oils in it that are potentially toxic. I believe it has a peroxide type of compound that's an essential oil. And so this also has antimicrobial, antiparasitic effects. I think they've used it for intestinal worms. Like it has an anthelmintic effect as well. It's used to clean the blood as well. That's what alteratives are blood cleansers. So it has a lot of other things. I would say that because of the isoquinolines, those alone would make me cautious to take it long term on its own. I have given it to people for like 6 months to a year without seeing any adverse effects, and it's it's indicated long term. But with pregnancy, you definitely would want to be careful with it. So I haven't seen any studies suggesting that it's not safe to do, but I kind of wonder if there's better herbs you could be using in gallstone formulas that would have potentially less risk associated with it. So I've been using it less often now. It's harder to find once Health Canada changes regulations. This isn't one of the main herbs on the market like they used to be. But anyways, so this is a good herb. The essential oils in it have some interesting properties that act as an antiseptic. It has presumably some carminative effects, although those are kind of shadowed by the other things. I think if you knew it has isoquinolines, you can deduce from that it's going to be an antimicrobial, it's going to be a bitter, and that's like, for exam purposes, I'd be happy if you knew that. And you might have to line up the Latin name for boldo is Pumis boldo, not Hydrastis canadensis. Okay. So we're still in the bitters. Some of these I gave slightly different headers to them. Like if I say wormwood's a bitter and this one's an antilithic, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have other things, but that's just sort of one of the big things that it has. Wormwood's a very interesting plant. This is infamous for its use in the liquor industry to make wormwood or to make absinthe. So Artemisia absinthium is used to make the liqueur called absinthe. Now, absinthe is banned in most of the Western worlds because of its thulione content. Thulione is an essential oil which you can find in wormwood, but it's also found in other herbs, including cedar that grows around most people's cedar shrubs. Yellow cedar contains high amounts of thulione in the essential oil, and yellow cedar is one of the four most revered plants in the Ojibwe people, the First Nations people in Canada. It's one of the big ones, cedar, and it has some very positive things. The problem with thuyon is that it's a neurotoxin. It has a stimulating effect on the nervous system, and then if you were to take, I mean, if you take a little bit of cedar, it's not going to be a problem. But if you drank 5 mils of cedar oil or wormwood oil, the essential oil, which you probably would have a hard time getting your hands on. But let's say if a child drank a bunch of cedar oil that you had in your vaporizer or whatever it is, your essential oil steaming device, I forget what those things are called. If a child drank it, it could cause death. And so it stimulates, it basically blocks your, I believe it's your GABA receptors in your body. That GABA basically has a calming effect. And so if you block them, it has a stimulatory effect. And so some of the early symptoms of overdose would be twitching, muscle contractions, and then eventually convulsions. And that's with acute dose. But chronically, it tends to act as a neurotoxin and can cause all sorts of negative effects, depression, it can have some other neurotoxicity. It can stimulate, if someone has it already, is predisposed to getting seizures, like has epilepsy, taking a herb like wormwood, in my opinion, would be contraindicated because of the thuyon content has that neurotoxin effect that could precipitate convulsions and seizures. So, so that's all the bad things. So you can get absinthe, but it's basically the thuyon's been removed from it. So the thuyon's the part that kind of makes it kind of that stimulating weird neurotoxin that's desired by some people. So the early Impressionist artists drank a lot of absinthe for that component. It has some fun things associated with it. So if you drink absinthe, it's like the thuyon stimulates the nervous system, but then the alcohol suppresses the nervous system. So it's kind of like drinking, Jaeger and Red Bull. One's a stimulant, one's a sedative. So wormwood in particular, why it has its name is because it contains sesquiterpene lactones, in particular absinthin, which is a sesquiterpene lactone dimer. So it's got two of these guys stuck together that has some important antimicrobial effects. It's used not just for worms, but also other types of infections. Wormwood also has some important anti-inflammatory effects. If you remember back to the phytochemistry, sesquiterpene lactones, anytime you hear lactones, that basically means it's going to taste very bitter. And there is no doubt that with wormwood, when you taste it, the bitterness is coming from the absinthin, from the sesquiterpene lactones, and then there's an aromatic oils associated with it, that thuyon, but also pinene and some other essential oils are found in it as well, that give it a carminative effect. So wormwood has both this bitter and carminative action associated with it. And so as a bitter, you're going to get the stomachic, the cholagogue, the choleritic, but the essential oils and maybe some other constituents give it a carminative and antispasmodic effect. And so some herbalists and herbal traditions will give wormwood, in addition to being used for intestinal worms, will say that it's indicated for biliary colic. So some of the German books will describe that wormwood's an indication for that. So the bitterness gets the bile flowing, but then has this antispasmodic and carminative effect that helps to relax the cramping that's often associated with gallstones with some people. And so it's a specific indication. So you could use this acutely to relieve that cramping and spasming in the gallbladder. So I've used this in formulas for gallstones combined with other antispasmodic herbs to relieve the discomfort of gallstones while you're in the process of dissolving them. Wormwood has some hepatoprotective effects as well. Anti-inflammatory effects. Interestingly enough, there was a study done with patients with Crohn's disease, and they found giving wormwood helped to keep the Crohn's in remission longer than people in the control group. So something in wormwood has some immunosuppressant effects that may be beneficial for inflammatory bowel disease. And then there's that undesirable effect of being a neurotoxin. Okay? So wormwood's useful herb. You gotta watch out. Again, here's another herb. I think you must know the herbs that you can't use during pregnancy. There's some gray area, and then there's some very, when it comes to safety, there's black, there's white, and there's a whole lot of gray, but this does not fall in the gray area. Coffee's in the gray area for sure. Wormwood is not in the gray area. You don't want to mess around with that, okay? Essential oil diffuser, thank you. Sorry, the time change was hard on me. Kids don't know about time change. They just wake up. You go to bed later, they wake up at the same time, and they always mess up my sleep. So you guys lost sound for a few seconds? Karen? Or is it only one person? Or did you guys lose? Did I break up for a second? The bitter effect of wormwood? Okay, it's a couple people did. Yeah. How long did you lose before? 4 seconds. Okay, I don't know. I can say a lot in 4 seconds. Still got the main idea. Okay, you're good. Thank you. So wormwood's a bitter. It's not my gentian is my go-to daily bitter. Wormwood, I use it more when there's cramping pains, and I might consider using it for as an anti-inflammatory in Crohn's, but my concern with that is how can I avoid giving the thulium long term, okay? Now chicory is another nice bitter. So chicory is something that if you want to consume, chicory is more like a vegetable than a herb in a lot of ways, because chicory root was once roasted and used as an adulterant for coffee. So in the old days, coffee was very expensive. Chicory was a weed that grew all over the world, like literally in Europe, Asia, it's all over North America. I mean, it grows, if it was the summertime, I would be willing to bet $1,000 I could find it within 5 minutes of leaving my clinic or my house, because it just grows everywhere. Now, the leaf of it can be used in salads, and there's certain versions of chicory and certain varieties of it that are grown for, I think, is it endive? I think endive is one form of chicory that's used in salads, and the roots is used as a bitter, often for liver teas and things. It tastes quite pleasant. So the main active ingredient that imparts its bitter qualities is lactucin. Lactucin is a sesquiterpene lactone. I think it's the main thing. There may be other things in there as well. It's also found in lettuces. So lactucin is found in the white latex of like romaine lettuce. It's also going to be found in chicory. And so you can drink the roasted roots. You can eat the leaves of the salad. If you buy the endive, it's going to have that digestive bitter effect. It's going to have other nutrients in it. And I'm not really going to be concerned about people doing this long term. So I think this is something that's health promoting to consume on a regular basis because of the relatively safe nature compared to some of the other herbs that we described as a digestive tonic taking long term, okay? In general, chicory is used, it was used by the ancient Greeks. It was Galen, one of the early Greek doctors, referred to it as friend of the liver, or the liver's best friend, because it acts as a hepatoprotective and stimulates bile production. So all these bitters were once used for jaundice, gallstones, digestive upset, and things like that. Often, that's a good question. Annan's saying that often you'll see chicory used as a additive of food. The reason for that is that chicory root is rich in inulin, and inulin is a type of fiber that can act as a prebiotic and feed the good bacteria, but it can also produce a little bit more gas. So if you get a lot of flatulence, check and see if it contains chicory in it, because not everybody does well with chicory products. So you'll see it in ice creams and other things. I'm assuming it has a thickening-like effect and works that way as well. So yeah, it is added as a food additive, but I know some people, they eat it, they get very foul-smelling gas. Inulin is also found in Jerusalem artichoke, and although it's good as a prebiotic, it produces a lot of gas. So if it makes you fart, it's probably the chicory, okay? Again, as a coffee substitute, it's great. The irony is now probably chicory is more expensive than coffee, even though it's a weed, just because coffee is so broadly available. So they're probably adulterating trickier products with coffee now, but I'm just joking. But now it is an antimicrobial to some degree, but I don't find it's going to have this, it's not as potent an antimicrobial. So this is something I would feel comfortable consuming regularly and as a coffee substitute or as a in your salads long term without any ill effects, significant side effects, and just act as a nice dietary bitter. I mean, yes, some of the same side effects or cautions that apply with some of the other bitters would apply. With pregnancy, it's probably safe, I would say, compared to golden seal. Just like romaine lettuce is probably safe. Yeah, because it kind of falls under that umbrella of a food, but you got to be careful with it still. Now, dandelion is another herb. I don't use chicory and dandelion in tincture forms very often, just because the dose range is usually pretty high for them, and it becomes expensive in tincture form. But they're great if you're going to have roasted dandelion and chicory in like a decoction, like when you make it as tea or as the dry herb and you extract it that way. I think it's more cost effective to do that. Plus, you get the prebiotics like the inulin that we described earlier on, which is in it. But dandelion, you can also eat the leaves. So it's a lot like chicory. They're both in the Asteraceae family. And so they both have sesquiterpene lactones. This has a slightly different one than you get in the chicory, which is the lactucin. But good bitter tonics that can be consumed long term. That yellow flower probably is loaded with flavonoids as well, so I'm sure there's benefits to eating the flower as well. Often, bitters in general often are used for chronic skin conditions, and dandelion and chicory and burdock as well are often used for acne treatments. Now, another bitter that's commonly eaten as a food is globe artichoke. So this is like a little cross section. I remember as a kid, you used to steam these up or boil them in water, and then you'd rip off the outer leaves and you scrape them on your teeth. Usually dip them in butter, which I wouldn't do that anymore. But dip them in butter, and I'm getting a message here from that must be over. Yeah, I gotta get out of here. So I'll just finish this slide really quickly. So with the globe artichoke, the main benefits. Oh, you know what? Let's come back to it. It's 11:52. No need to rush over this. So next week we'll finish these herbs that I'm going through. Do you guys have any questions before you guys get kicked out of there? No. So a couple of people get kicked out of the classroom.